Hello, everybody. I'm here with Rebecca Oldham, and we're going to be talking about recruiter enablement. So, Rebecca, thank you very much for joining me, and give us a quick introduction to you and your background.
Absolutely. So I'm Rebecca Oldham. I've been in recruiting for about 9 years now. Like most of us, started in agency recruitment, moved very swiftly to Amazon, working on the UK and I business primarily. Moved to Germany to join Adidas in their HQ in Herzogenaurach. Moved back to London where I was able to join Mastercard, and I'm now the Director of Talent Acquisition for Europe and also the Middle East and Africa.
That's probably the most lightning speed career progression that I've heard anybody on this channel describe since we started it. So congratulations, you're obviously a high flyer.
Thanks.
Rebecca, what's recruiter enablement to you?
I was having a real think about this one, Adam. For me, it's two things. First, I think it's the ecosystem that we build around recruiters, and that's not just technology. And I think there is so much emphasis that's put on technology, but part of it is related to technology and whatever that technology means to you as a kind of recruiting function. But it's also the processes and the business teams that surround the recruitment team. So that might be your HR services teams, that could be total rewards, it could be the onboarding team, for example. But the biggest thing for me when we're thinking about recruiter enablement is you've got this lovely ecosystem, but it's actually how the recruiter interacts with that ecosystem. So thinking a little bit more around, do your teams have the curiosity that it takes to interact with the ecosystem? So are they inquisitive about how processes work? Have they forged really strong relationships with the business support functions and find ways that they can be efficient and speed things up and work more closely with those businesses? But I also think how they drive their own initiative within that ecosystem is basically what all encompasses, I would say, kind of recruiter enablement. So it's those two elements for me.
Some of what you just described there is to do with the personal characteristics of the team members. And I'm wondering whether that all comes down to you recruiting people that have those characteristics, or you putting in place processes and learning and things that kind of bring that out of people.
I think it's a bit of both. I think there is kind of fundamental characteristics that if I'm recruiting for my team in particular, I would look for. And it is that kind of level of initiative, that curiosity, somebody that you know that can be quite independent and own things, but also somebody that's going to work really well as a team. But I also think it's the mechanisms and the tools that you put in place, particularly around kind of coaching, training, really understanding some of these super complex processes, particularly when we're talking about these big matrix environments. They can get super complicated. So how, as a recruiting leadership team, can we break that down, really drive engagement and education? How can we reform processes? So I do think it's a little bit of both. There has to be the initial characteristics of a recruiter that's going to make them super successful, but it's also how, as a recruiter leadership team or an operations team or whoever it may be, is able to explain and really harness those processes in the best possible way. So it's a little bit of both, I would say.
Okay, so how much should we be templating the workflows and things like content assets and things like that for recruiters to enable them, versus I think if you do that too much, there's a risk that you can just automate the whole process. And what's your comments on that?
Automation is so important, and I've been telling my teams for months and months and months, when you get into a busy period, automation is absolutely key, because automation, it's scalable, particularly if you're working in a global function, right? It can get really tricky if you're having to go back and kind of re-template every process or change the process for every hiring manager. So automate what you can, create scalable environments, but don't lose the personality. And this is the really key function for me is I think as recruiters, we have to have our own personal brand and our own personalities when we're showing up with the business and our stakeholders. Don't lose that because everything is automated and kind of already templated and ready to go. we can make inflections in that and actually bring a little bit of personality or a little bit of individualism to some of these processes as well. But I think it has to be a balance. If you offer an individual personalized experience to everyone, you're never going to get the high volume recruitment that you would need in these big matrix environments. But it's also important from a trust perspective and building those relationships that you can flex and you can provide a little bit more personality. The way that I would kind of function it is more this kind of talent advisory mindset, is that you have everything in terms of your processes, your workflows, they're documented, but you can add a little bit of personalization in on top as well.
So how does a recruiter go from filling jobs to becoming a talent advisor?
This is a really good question. I don't know whether you've seen it, Adam, but there is a diagram floating around and it's a triangle and it focuses very much on kind of what we can control and also what we can change and ask for flexibility around. I think for me, and when I'm talking to my recruiters, in order to show up as a talent advisor, you have to come really well prepared with talent intelligence. So you should really know what space you're recruiting in. And it could be very high level. It could be reading the news. It could be reading business articles. It could be going to buy your business a coffee and understanding what on earth they're doing. But having that talent intelligence of what does this role do in the market? Is it in demand? What does it pay? Where do these people usually tend to come from? You're already showing up as a talent advisor if you're bringing that element. But the bit that I think makes the biggest difference is how do you coach and really drive hiring managers to make changes within things like the skill sets that they're requiring. So rather than these really long laundry lists that they're bringing you, it's how do we cultivate that? How do we make that more attractive to candidates? How do we find out what you really need? And a lot of it is kind of the way that we ask probing questions. I think finding flexibility is also important within this as well. So they may have a fixed idea of location, of salary, of the type of educational background they're looking for. How do we find that flexibility? And like I mentioned, it does come to this kind of pyramid, which I think is time, cost, and speed. So how do we find that? So showing up and being able to educate and really bring, like I said, the intelligence together, but also really focusing around how do I get the best possible outcome for me to go and be able to find a long list and then a short list eventually, and eventually a hire. So it's really about finding flexibility. That's how I would describe somebody showing up as a talent advisor.
Right. So you I'm gonna give you a statement and tell me what you think about it. So I think you as a talent acquisition leader have got two jobs, and I think your job is to represent talent acquisition to leaders in the organization. And I think your job is also to be a servant for your recruiters, because enabling them is your obligation. Would you agree with that?
Some piece probably less so, because I whenever anyone mentions service mentality, I'm like, no, 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 we're not a service provider, we are an advisor. So I understand what you mean, though. I think in terms of arming recruiters with all they need, the way I would pitch it is I'm almost acting like a coach. I'll always teach somebody how to fish and hope that they can go and fish by themselves later. And I think that's partly what recruiter enablement is. It's not about me giving somebody the answers consistently, because it goes back to that being kind of intuitive and being curious. I would like to teach people how to fish and enable them with everything that I've got, but it takes them to really understand to then run that with the business. So I completely agree in terms of partnering with the business and being kind of a face to the business and really owning that experience. But I would say in terms of the recruiters, I would love to be able to enable them once and give them everything that they need, but they have to take the bits that they need and run with that as well.
Yeah. Okay. Great balance. Okay, last question. You've turned up in a new job and talent acquisition's a complete shambles. Like from a recruiter enablement perspective, what's maybe the first couple of things that you're going to do?
Gosh, if it's in a shambles, that's a really good question. I think for me, and particularly coming into any of these kind of larger organizations as I've had and completely different levels, is really understanding what is done now and why it's done. And I think it's always really curious. And I see it region to region, actually, in my current role. Everyone has a slightly different perception of what does talent acquisition mean in that business at this time.
Yeah.
And what does that mean in terms of the service level that we provide and also the expectation around that as well. So I think if I went into TA and any organization was shambles, is really understanding where we are today and what do we possibly need to change in terms of the organizational structure, the function, but also going out there and resetting expectations, because I think that's the most important thing with this is let's re-level, let's reset the expectations. And could be SLAs, could be KPIs, it could be resetting expectations in terms of what we're doing entirely, because we may not even be offering a TA service, right? But resetting those expectations with the business is something that I would listen first, reset expectations, and then start thinking about the structure of the TA team before diving into anything like technology and things like that.
I think that's really important because we're living in a world where almost everybody thinks they're a recruitment expert. And I'm not sure there's actually very many more complicated jobs than recruitment.
For
So
sure.
that approach is right. Okay, for anybody that's listening to this, I would like to let you know that I gave Rebecca a sort of bit of a briefing before we started recording, and I said I'm gonna ask these three simple questions, and then I've just thrown her a whole bunch of curveballs in there, completely unprompted. So Rebecca, sorry about that, but your answers are absolutely brilliant. So thank you very much for taking the time to join me. It's been great, and looking forward to seeing you again.
Thanks, Adam.